I discovered my wife had been cheating on me, and it was like someone had ripped the ground out from under my feet. For months, I had felt something was off, those late-night phone calls she brushed off as, just work, the sudden secrecy around her phone, and the way she seemed distant, even when she was sitting right next to me. I tried to ignore it, I really did. I convinced myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking, but there's a moment when you can't lie to yourself anymore. For me, that moment came when I found out she'd been going to doctor's appointments with her lover. And the worst part? She was pregnant. I didn't even know how to react. The words, "the child isn't yours," kept echoing in my head, taunting me, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. It felt like my whole life had been a lie, and there was no coming back from this. I remember sitting across from her, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, and asking the question I dreaded the most. Is it true? She didn't need to answer. The look on her face was enough. There was no confusion, no attempt to deny it. Just a cold, hard truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. When I confronted her, she just stood there, silent. Her eyes looked distant, almost as if she was relieved that her secret was out. I wanted to scream, to make her feel the same pain that was tearing me apart, but all I could manage was a broken whisper. How could you? And yet, even in that moment, she didn't try to hide it. She confessed everything. She had been seeing him for months, sneaking around while I was at work, while I was home cooking dinner, even on those days I thought she was just out running errands. All the while, she was building a life with someone else, a life I was never supposed to be a part of. And then came the final blow. She was carrying his child. My first instinct was to laugh, a bitter, hollow laugh, because it all seemed so surreal, so absurd. Here I was, the devoted husband, planning our future together, and there she was, with another man's child growing inside her. "I'm sorry," she said, and I almost believed her. But apologies don't change betrayal, and they sure as hell don't erase the image of your wife holding hands with another man, walking into a clinic, and finding out she's carrying his baby. I wasted no time. That same day, I filed for divorce. There was no discussion, no second chances, no attempts at counseling. Just a clean, swift cut from the person I had once considered the love of my life. I left the house with nothing but a bag of clothes and a sense of betrayal so deep, I thought it would swallow me whole. I couldn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, whispering, making plans that didn't include me. It should have ended there, but it didn't. That was just the beginning. I thought I had unraveled everything, that I had seen the worst of it. But the truth was darker than I could have ever imagined. Just when I thought I had escaped, just when I began to piece my life back together, a revelation would come that would drag me back into the mess, forcing me to confront the reality that I didn't even know the full extent of her betrayal. One day, a letter arrived, a letter that wasn't meant for me. It was addressed to her, but the sender's name was unfamiliar. I wasn't going to open it at first. I wanted nothing to do with her life anymore, but something about it felt off. Against my better judgment, I tore it open, and there it was, a lab report. A paternity test. And the name on it? Not mine. Not even the lover's. Someone else entirely. I felt like I had been thrown into a nightmare, one that just kept getting worse no matter how hard I tried to wake up. She had lied to me, lied to him, lied to everyone. The man she had been sneaking around with wasn't even the father. She was pregnant with another man's child, a third man. And suddenly, I was plunged back into the chaos, forced to untangle a web of deceit that was far more twisted than I had ever thought possible. The questions kept piling up. Who was this other man? How long had this been going on? And what else was she hiding from me, from everyone? I knew I needed answers, but each step closer to the truth was like stepping on shards of glass, painful and excruciating. I thought I could move on, but how do you move on when every new discovery pulls you deeper into the lie? She thought she could keep it all buried, that her secrets would die in the darkness she hid them in. But secrets don't stay buried forever. They have a way of clawing their way to the surface, and when they do, they bring everything down with them. I had spent so much time thinking the worst had already happened, that I had endured the deepest cut. But the truth has a way of proving you wrong. What was supposed to be a clean break turned into a tangled mess of lies, deceit, and betrayal, revealing not just the cracks in my marriage, but the chasms. And there I was, standing on the edge, looking into an abyss I hadn't even known existed. I thought I knew how this would end, but I was wrong. There was one last secret waiting to be uncovered, one that would change everything. But I wasn't prepared for it, not even close. Welcome to the channel, where we stand firmly against any form of betrayal. The stories you hear are fictional, but their message is clear: infidelity destroys lives, relationships, and trust. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear is a shocking, intense, and emotional journey. Get ready for a story that will make you think twice about the choices we make and the secrets we keep. Enjoy, and brace yourself for a wild ride. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the streets, when Michael parked his car outside the brownstone he shared with his wife, Emily. It was a classic, beautiful building, a symbol of the life they had built together over the last 6 years. From the outside, it looked perfect, charming, elegant, and timeless. Much like their marriage had seemed to everyone who knew them. Michael stepped out of the car, loosened his tie, and let out a sigh. It had been a long day at the office, but coming home to Emily was supposed to make it all worthwhile. She was his anchor, his calm after the storm, or at least, that was what he wanted to believe. Inside, Emily stood in the kitchen, carefully setting the table for dinner. She moved with an almost practiced precision, placing each utensil and plate with care. She glanced at her reflection in the kitchen window, adjusting her hair, and forcing a smile. There was something about her expression, calm, yet strained. It was a face she had learned to put on, a mask that shielded whatever turmoil lay beneath. She heard the front door open and quickly turned her attention back to the kitchen, making sure everything looked perfect. "Hey, honey," Michael called as he stepped inside, his voice warm but tired. He shrugged off his coat, hanging it by the door. "Something smells great." Emily turned to greet him with a bright smile, the kind that seemed almost too perfect. "I'm making your favorite," she said, her voice light and cheerful, as if she had no worries in the world. "Thought it'd be nice to have a quiet night, just the two of us." Michael walked over and kissed her on the cheek, letting his lips linger for a moment longer than usual. He had been feeling distant from her lately, like there was a gap between them he couldn't quite bridge, and he was trying, desperately, to reconnect. "That sounds perfect," he replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily had always been good at keeping things together, at making everything seem flawless, but tonight there was something different, a tension just beneath the surface that he couldn't ignore. They sat down to dinner, and the conversation flowed, but it was laced with an unspoken discomfort. Michael talked about his day at work, the usual office gossip, but his mind kept drifting. He noticed how Emily's smile would fade for just a second when she thought he wasn't looking, how her hands fidgeted nervously with the napkin in her lap. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he knew her too well to miss it. Emily listened to him talk, nodding and smiling in all the right places, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She wanted to be present, to focus on the man she had once loved so effortlessly, but it felt like her mind was 1,000 miles away. She could feel the weight of secrets pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, but she forced herself to keep up the facade. She had to. If Michael knew what was really going on, it would shatter everything. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. After dinner, they settled onto the couch, a bottle of wine between them. It had been a ritual of theirs, a way to unwind and talk, but tonight the silence between sips was louder than usual. Michael could feel the distance growing, and it terrified him. He had always prided himself on knowing Emily, on being able to read her moods, but lately, she had become an enigma. He didn't know how to reach her anymore, and that realization gnawed at him. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the glass of wine. "Of course," she replied, her smile returning, but it was thin, barely there. "Why wouldn't I be?" Michael didn't know how to respond. He wanted to press her, to ask her what was wrong, but he was afraid of what he might find if he did. Instead, he just nodded and took another sip, trying to ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind that told him something was terribly wrong. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when their love had been easy, effortless. They had met at a mutual friend's party, and from the moment Michael had seen her, he knew she was different. Emily had a way of lighting up a room, of making everything seem brighter and more alive. She was smart, funny, and had a warmth that made everyone feel at ease. Michael had fallen hard and fast, and within a year, they were married. It had felt like a fairy tale, the kind of love that people spent their whole lives searching for. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The late nights at the office, the missed dinners, the quiet moments that had once been filled with laughter now felt heavy, strained. Michael had tried to ignore it, to brush it off as the normal ups and downs of a long-term relationship, but it was getting harder to pretend. He could feel her slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. Emily, on the other hand, was battling her own demons. She had started seeing someone else, and though she had convinced herself it was just a harmless fling, something to fill the void, it had become much more complicated than that. Every time she looked at Michael, she felt a pang of guilt, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief. She had spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, that she had lost herself in the process. With this other man, she felt seen, understood in a way she hadn't in years. But it was a dangerous game she was playing, and deep down, she knew it couldn't last. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the minutes as they sat there, side by side, but miles apart. Michael leaned back on the couch, his eyes drifting to the window, where the city lights flickered in the distance. "I miss us," he said quietly, almost to himself. Emily's heart clenched at his words. She opened her mouth to say something, to offer some reassurance, but no words came out. She wanted to tell him that she missed them too, that she was sorry for whatever it was that had come between them, but the truth was too heavy, too complex to fit into a simple apology. Instead, she just reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, hoping it would be enough to hold everything together for just a little while longer. Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He could feel her slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. He thought about all the things he had planned for their future, the vacations, the late-night talks, the family they had talked about starting one day. It all felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. They finished the bottle of wine, and after a few more moments of silence, Emily got up and excused herself, saying she had to make a quick call. Michael watched her go, feeling a strange sense of finality in the way she walked out of the room. He wanted to call her back, to tell her to stay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just sat there, staring at the empty wine glass, wondering how things had gotten so complicated, so fast. Emily stepped out onto the balcony, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. She needed to hear his voice, to remind herself why she was doing this, but as she dialed the number, a wave of panic washed over her. What was she thinking? How had she let things get this far? But it was too late now. She was in too deep, and there was no easy way out. Back inside, Michael glanced at the clock. It was late, and he could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the distant sounds of the city that never seemed to sleep. He wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch, that they could find their way back to each other, but deep down, he knew that something had changed. And whatever it was pulling them apart, little by little, with every passing day. Michael had been trying harder than ever to bring some normalcy back into his marriage. He arranged surprise dinner dates, weekend getaways, even small gestures like leaving notes in Emily's bag before she went to work. He was determined to close the distance between them, even if it felt like he was grasping at straws. But with every gesture, every attempt to reach out, he could feel Emily pulling further away, and he didn't know why. One evening, after yet another quiet, uncomfortable dinner, Michael sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. He hadn't seen Emily since she left to run errands earlier that afternoon, and she still hadn't returned. He checked his phone, but there were no messages. It wasn't unusual for her to be out late, but lately, it had become a regular occurrence. He wanted to trust her, to believe that there was a simple explanation for her absences, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Earlier that day, Emily had met up with David, the man she had been seeing in secret for months. What had started as a harmless distraction had turned into something deeper, something she hadn't been prepared for. David was the opposite of Michael, spontaneous, carefree, and unburdened by the responsibilities that weighed Michael down. When she was with him, she felt alive, like she had found a part of herself that had been missing. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew that what they had couldn't last. It was a fantasy, a dangerous escape from the reality she couldn't face. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as they sat in a dimly lit corner of a cafe. "I'm married, David. I have a life that doesn't include you." David reached across the table and took her hand, his eyes soft yet firm. "Then why are you here, Emily? Why do you keep coming back to me?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was, she didn't know why she kept coming back. Maybe it was the thrill, or maybe it was the way he made her feel, like she was the center of someone's world, even if it was all temporary. But every time she left him, she was pulled back into the reality of her marriage, and the guilt would eat away at her, a little more each day. That night, as she drove home, Emily rehearsed the conversation she knew she needed to have with Michael. She would tell him the truth, that things had gone too far, that she had made mistakes. But the closer she got to their home, the heavier her chest felt. How could she break his heart like this? How could she face him, knowing the pain she was about to cause? Michael, meanwhile, had been cleaning up after dinner when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from his friend, Josh. "Hey, are you free tomorrow? I wanted to grab a drink and catch up." Michael replied with a quick, "Sure, sounds good," but as he set his phone down, something caught his eye. A new notification, but this one wasn't from Josh. It was from an unknown number. Without thinking, he opened it. The message was brief, but it felt like a punch to the gut. "Thought you should know, your wife's been spending a lot of time with another man. I saw them together today." Attached was a photo of Emily, sitting at a table in a cafe, her hand clasped in someone else's. Michael's heart stopped. He stared at the image, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It felt like someone had ripped the ground out from under him. Every doubt, every fear he had been suppressing for weeks, all of it came crashing down at once. He wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that there was some explanation, but deep down, he knew. He had known for a while, but he hadn't wanted to face it. Emily walked through the door shortly after, her face pale and tired. She had planned on heading straight to bed, avoiding any confrontation until she had gathered the strength to talk to Michael, but as soon as she saw him standing there in the living room, her heart sank. She could tell from the look on his face that something was wrong. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp, like the edge of a knife. I was out, just running errands," she stammered, avoiding his gaze. "It's been a long day, can we talk about this tomorrow?" Michael stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "No, we're talking about it now." "Who is he, Emily?" The color drained from her face. For a moment, she considered lying, making up a story to buy herself some time, but she knew it was useless. She could see it in his eyes, he already knew. She had underestimated him, thinking she could keep this secret buried, but now it was all unraveling, and there was nowhere to hide. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "His name is David," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I met him a few months ago, and I made a mistake. I'm sorry, Michael. I never meant for this to happen." The room felt like it was spinning. Michael's vision blurred as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice cracking. "You call this a mistake? You've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, and all you have to say is that it was a mistake." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Michael didn't know whether to scream or cry. He had spent months trying to fix things, to bring back the warmth and connection they had once shared, and all the while, she had been slipping further and further away, into the arms of another man. He wanted to be angry, to hate her for what she had done, but all he felt was a deep, hollow ache, like a piece of him had been ripped out. He turned away, unable to look at her any longer. "I need some time," he said, his voice barely holding steady. "Just go to bed, Emily. We'll talk in the morning." Emily hesitated, but then she nodded and quietly walked upstairs, leaving Michael standing alone in the darkened room. He could hear her footsteps fade away, and then the silence engulfed him. He had always thought their love was strong enough to survive anything, but now he wasn't so sure. As he sank down onto the couch, his mind replayed the image of her at that cafe, holding hands with someone else. He had seen the truth, but it felt like a bad dream, one he was desperate to wake up from. Yet, there was a part of him that refused to believe it was over, that there was still more to this story, something he had yet to uncover. But for now, all he could do was wait, and brace himself for whatever revelation would come next. Michael barely slept that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last few weeks, trying to find the signs he had missed, the clues that had been right in front of him. Emily had confessed, but something still didn't add up. There were too many questions left unanswered, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he wasn't ready to let it go. He needed to understand why this had happened, and he needed the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, he woke up determined. He had been passive for too long, letting things unfold around him without taking control. That would change today. He waited until Emily came downstairs, her face pale and tired, her eyes red from a night of restless sleep. She barely looked at him as she poured herself a cup of coffee, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands shook slightly as she brought the cup to her lips. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. Emily froze, then slowly set her cup down, bracing herself. She knew this conversation was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. "Michael, no," he interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "I'm not here for another apology. I need to understand what's been going on, and I need you to be honest with me. No more lies, no more excuses. I deserve that much, at least." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape the confrontation, but there was nowhere left to hide. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay. Ask me whatever you want." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "How long have you been seeing him?" 6 months, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't supposed to be serious, but things got out of hand. Out of hand? Michael's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "You were sneaking around behind my back for 6 months, Emily. That's not out of hand, that's betrayal. Do you even understand what you've done?" "I do," she replied, her voice cracking. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything. But it wasn't supposed to be this way. I never meant for you to find out." Michael laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "Well, you failed spectacularly at that, didn't you?" He could see her flinch, and for a moment, he almost regretted his harshness. Almost. Why him? What did he give you that I couldn't? Emily hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It wasn't about you, Michael. It was never about you. I felt lost. I felt like I was disappearing, like I didn't recognize myself anymore. And with him, I felt seen. Seen. Michael repeated, incredulous. I've been here, every day, trying to make this work. I've been trying to hold on to you, to us, and you're telling me that wasn't enough? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I'm sorry, she whispered, and he could hear the sincerity in her voice. I'm so sorry. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to fill the entire room. Michael felt like he was drowning in it, struggling to breathe. Is he the father? The question had been gnawing at him, and even though he dreaded the answer, he needed to hear it from her. Emily's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. What? No. Michael, no. I don't even know if I'm pregnant. The room seemed to spin, and Michael had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. I saw you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. At the clinic. I saw you with him. Emily's face went pale, and she took a step back, as if she had been struck. That wasn't. I wasn't there for that. I went with him because he asked me to. He thought, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. What did he think, Emily? Michael pressed, his patience fraying. What the hell is going on? He thought I was pregnant, okay, she blurted out, her voice trembling. He wanted to know if it was his. But it wasn't his. Michael's mind reeled. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together, and every answer she gave seemed to lead to more questions. So, if it wasn't his, then whose was it? Emily hesitated, and in that moment, Michael saw something flicker in her eyes, fear, hesitation, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Michael, please, can we not do this right now? No, he said, his voice steely and determined. We're doing this now. I need to know. Emily's hands were shaking as she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I didn't want to show you this, she said softly. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I can't. Michael took the paper from her, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. It was a lab report, and as he scanned the words, his heart stopped. The blood drained from his face as he read the result, a paternity test. And the name listed wasn't his, and it wasn't David's. Who is this? He demanded, his voice barely holding back his anger. Who the hell is this? Emily's lips quivered, and she seemed to struggle with the words. His name is Mark, she said finally. I met him at a conference last year, and it was a mistake. It was one night, and I thought it was over. But a few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant, and I panicked. Michael felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. So, David, he's not even the father. He could barely believe what he was hearing. You've been carrying on with two men behind my back. No. Emily shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I wasn't. I didn't plan any of this. I made a terrible mistake, and I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. Michael's vision blurred, and he had to take a step back, as if distancing himself from her would make the reality less painful. You've been lying to me, Emily. 4 months. And not just about one affair, but 2. How could you do this? I was afraid, she cried, her voice choked with sobs. I was afraid of losing you, of losing everything. I thought if I could just figure it out, if I could just make it right, then none of this would matter. But it does matter, and I'm sorry. Michael stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had built a life with, had been hiding this from him all along. He felt like a fool, like everything he had been fighting for was just an illusion, a cruel joke that had been played on him. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You want me to just forget about all of this? Pretend that none of this happened?" Emily shook her head, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "No, I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know the truth. I'm so sorry, Michael. I never wanted to hurt you." He didn't know what to say. He had spent so long trying to fix things, to make their marriage work, but now he didn't even know what he was fighting for. The betrayal was too deep, too painful, and he couldn't see a way back. All he could see was the image of Emily with another man, and then another, and the realization that everything he thought he knew was a lie. Michael turned away, unable to look at her any longer. "I need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this right now." Emily reached out, her hand trembling, but he stepped back, out of her reach. "Michael, please," but he didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving her standing there, tears streaming down her face. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he felt a strange sense of numbness, like he was floating outside of his own body. He didn't know where he was going, or what he was going to do. All he knew was that the life he thought he had was over, and he was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered reality. And as he drove away, a million questions swirled in his mind, questions that had no easy answers. Who was Mark? How had Emily managed to keep this hidden for so long? And most of all, how had he been so blind to it all? But there was one thing he did know: this was just the beginning. There were more secrets, more lies, and he was going to find out every single one of them, no matter what it took. Michael drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, his mind a storm of emotions. The betrayal, the lies, the revelation of a child that wasn't his, it all swirled around him, suffocating him. He pulled over to the side of a quiet street, the engine still running, and leaned back in his seat, trying to make sense of everything. How had his life unraveled so quickly? Just a few days ago, he was trying to hold on to the fragile remnants of his marriage, and now he was standing on the edge of a chasm, staring into an abyss of deceit he never thought possible. He thought about Emily, about the way she had looked at him that morning, her eyes full of fear and regret. Part of him wanted to believe that she was truly sorry, that her tears were genuine. But how could he trust anything she said after all the lies? It wasn't just about the affairs anymore. It was about the fact that she had deceived him, manipulated him, and let him believe in a life that was never real. And now, there was a child involved, a child that wasn't his, a child that came from a night he had no part in. The weight of it all felt unbearable. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a message from Josh, his friend who had reached out the day before. "Hey, I'm around if you need to talk. I'm worried about you." For a moment, Michael considered ignoring it. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to hear anyone tell him that everything was going to be okay when it clearly wasn't. But then he realized he needed to get out of his own head, even if just for a little while. He typed a quick reply, "I'll be at the bar in 20, and started the car. When Michael walked into the bar, Josh was already there, nursing a beer. He looked up as Michael approached, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "Hey, man," he said, gesturing to the seat next to him. "You look like hell." Michael managed a weak smile as he sat down. "I feel worse." They sat in silence for a moment before Josh spoke again. "Want to talk about it?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Emily, she's been having an affair," he said quietly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "And not just one. There's someone else. I found out she's pregnant, and it's not even with the guy she's been seeing. It's with a third man." Josh's eyes widened. "Jesus, Mike. I don't even know what to say. That's a lot." Michael laughed bitterly. "Yeah, no kidding. They talked for a while, with Michael recounting everything that had happened, from the message that had exposed the affair to the confrontation with Emily. Josh listened, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded, but he didn't interrupt. He just let Michael vent, let him pour out the confusion, the anger, the heartbreak. When Michael finished, he felt a little lighter, but the pain was still there, a dull ache that refused to fade. "What are you going to do?" Josh asked after a long silence. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "Part of me wants to walk away, to just cut ties and move on. But it's not that simple. She's still my wife. We've been through so much together, and I don't know if I can just throw that all away." Josh nodded, understanding the dilemma. "But can you forgive her? Can you live with what she did?" That was the question, wasn't it? Could he forgive her? Could he find it in himself to look past the lies, the betrayal, and try to rebuild something from the ashes of their marriage? Or would he spend the rest of his life haunted by the memory of what she had done, unable to let go of the pain? Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I thought I knew her, you know. I thought, whatever problems we had, we could fix them. But this? This is so much bigger than I ever imagined." "Maybe you don't need to make a decision right now," Josh said gently. "Take some time. Figure out what you really want, not just what you think you should do." Michael nodded, but deep down, he knew he couldn't afford to wait forever. He had to confront Emily, had to get to the bottom of everything. There were still too many unanswered questions, and until he had the full picture, he couldn't move forward, no matter how much he wanted to. When he got back to the house, Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy. She had been crying, and the sight of her like that made Michael's heart clench. But he couldn't afford to be soft right now. He needed answers. "Emily," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to be completely honest with me. No more lies, no more half-truths. Who is Mark? How did this happen?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "He was a mistake," she began, her voice shaking. "I met him at a conference. It was just one night, and I never planned on seeing him again. But then I found out I was pregnant, and I didn't know what to do. I was scared, Michael. I thought I could just figure it out without involving you, but then things with David got complicated, and I lost control." Michael clenched his fists, trying to contain the anger bubbling inside him. "So, what? You thought you could just hide it? Lie to everyone and hope it would all go away?" "No," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't want to lie, but I didn't know what else to do. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You were protecting yourself, Emily. You were protecting your secrets. Do you even realize how selfish that is?" She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, Michael. Even when I was at my lowest, I never stopped loving you." Michael's heart ached at her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to find some semblance of truth in everything she was saying, but he didn't know if he could. "I don't know if that's enough," he said quietly. "I don't know if love is enough to fix this." They sat there, the silence stretching between them, heavy and suffocating. Emily reached out, her hand trembling, and placed it on his. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Michael looked down at her hand, then slowly pulled his away. "I need time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out if there's even anything left to save." Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She knew she couldn't push him, couldn't ask for more than he was willing to give. But as he stood up to leave, she felt a pang of desperation, a fear that if he walked out that door, he might never come back. "Michael," she called out, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." He paused, his back still turned to her. "I know," he said, and then he walked away, leaving her alone in the empty, quiet room. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him, clearing his mind for just a moment. He didn't know where he was going, or what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not yet. There were still pieces of the puzzle he didn't have, still shadows lurking in the corners of their shattered lives. And until he uncovered them all, there would be no peace, no closure. It had been a week since Michael had walked out of the house, leaving Emily alone with her apologies and regrets. In that time, he hadn't spoken to her, hadn't returned her calls or responded to her messages. He needed space to think, to breathe, and to decide what to do next. But he knew that avoiding the problem wouldn't make it disappear. He had to confront it, once and for all. One afternoon, Michael found himself standing outside the building of a law office. He had reached out to a lawyer to discuss the potential of a divorce, but as he stood there, his heart heavy, he wasn't sure if he could go through with it. He didn't just want to end things without knowing the full truth. He had to understand what had led them to this point, and what role he had played in the unraveling of their marriage. So, instead of going inside, he made a decision. He turned around, got into his car, and drove back to the house. It was time to face Emily and put everything on the table, once and for all. Emily was sitting on the porch when he arrived, her face etched with worry. She had been dreading this moment, but also desperately hoping for it. When she saw Michael step out of the car, she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. He walked towards her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, they just stood there, neither of them knowing what to say. "I need answers," Michael said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm tired of lies, tired of half-truths. I need to know everything, and I need to hear it from you." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll tell you everything," she said softly. "But not here. Let's go inside." They sat across from each other in the living room, a place that had once been filled with laughter and warmth but now felt cold and empty. Emily took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and began to speak. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to make up for," she said. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But you deserve the truth. The night I met Mark, it was at a conference out of town. We had too much to drink, and one thing led to another. I regretted it immediately, and I thought I could just forget about it, pretend it never happened. But then I found out I was pregnant, and I panicked. I didn't know if the baby was his or yours." Michael listened, his jaw clenched, trying to keep his emotions in check. "And David?" he asked. "What about him?" Emily's face crumpled with guilt. "That started after I found out I was pregnant. I was so scared, and I felt so alone. I didn't want to burden you with my mistakes, and I was looking for a way to escape, even if just for a little while. I met David by chance, and it just happened. But he never knew about Mark, or the baby. I didn't want anyone to know." Michael closed his eyes, trying to absorb everything she was saying. "You were willing to let me think the child was mine," he said quietly, the weight of her betrayal sinking in deeper. "You were going to bring another man's baby into our life, and you didn't think I deserved to know the truth." Emily's tears flowed freely now. "I didn't know what else to do, Michael. I was terrified of losing you. I thought, if I could just make it right, if I could find a way to fix everything, then none of this would have to come out. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Michael sat back, his mind racing. He wanted to scream at her, to make her understand the enormity of what she had done, but he realized something, she already knew. She was living with the weight of her own choices, and it was crushing her. For the first time, he saw just how broken she was, and a part of him almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'm going to ask you one last question," he said, his voice steady. "Do you still love me, Emily? Or was everything we had just another lie?" Emily's breath hitched, and she looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Of course I still love you," she whispered. "I've made so many mistakes, but my love for you, that was never a lie. I never stopped loving you." For a moment, Michael didn't know how to respond. He had wanted to hear those words, to believe that there was still something left between them worth saving. But now that he had heard them, he realized it wasn't enough. Love wasn't supposed to be this complicated, this painful. He could forgive her, maybe even understand why she had done what she did, but he couldn't forget. The trust had been shattered, and he didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. He stood up, his decision finally clear in his mind. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I can't live like this, Emily. I deserve better, and so do you. You need to find a way to move on from this, and so do I." Emily's face crumpled, and she sobbed, the reality of his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. "Please, Michael, don't do this. I'll do anything. We can go to counseling, we can start over." Michael shook his head. "It's too late for that. I'll always care about you, but I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. This marriage is broken, and it's time to let go." As he turned to leave, Emily reached out, grabbing his hand. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For everything." He looked down at her, his eyes softening for just a moment. "I know," he said. "But sometimes, sorry isn't enough." With that, he walked out of the house, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the deceit, the constant questioning of what was real and what wasn't, it was all over. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it, whatever it might be. Emily watched him leave, her heart shattering with every step he took. She had lost him, and there was no one to blame but herself. She sat there, alone, surrounded by the echoes of a life she had destroyed, and for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be alone. The news of their divorce spread quickly, and it wasn't long before David found out about everything. Shocked and hurt, he cut off all contact with Emily, realizing that he had been nothing more than a distraction in a much bigger mess. Mark, who had no idea about the chaos his one night with Emily had caused, was confronted with the reality of a child he never intended to have. Emily was left to navigate the fallout on her own, struggling to pick up the pieces of a life that had crumbled beyond repair. Michael, on the other hand, began to slowly rebuild. He moved out of the house they had shared and found a small apartment on the other side of town. It was modest, but it was his, and that was enough. He started going out more, reconnecting with friends, rediscovering parts of himself that he had lost over the years. It wasn't easy, but he was healing, bit by bit. Months later, he received a letter from Emily. She had moved out of town and was starting a new job, trying to piece together a new life for herself. The letter was an apology, a final attempt to explain herself, but Michael didn't need to read it. He had already found his own closure. He had learned to let go, and in doing so, he had found a new beginning. If you made it this far, thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. What did you think of the story? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life tales. Remember, betrayal never leads to happiness, and honesty is always the best policy. Until next time.